Hey everyone, welcome back to another week of TrueNAS Tech Talk. This is episode 12 with Kris and Kris. This week we'll have a quick update on the Fangtooth beta. Some code freezes happened and we'll be bringing that out fairly shortly. I'm going to dig a bit into compression space-saving methods such as dedupe and block cloning. And Kris is going to wade headfirst into the BSD versus GPL license wars. So this one should be exciting.
Soapbox icon. Can you get me one of those?
I will give you a virtual soapbox to stand on for this one, Kris. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thanks, Kris. And we'll do the quick update on what's coming up with Fangtooth. So beta 1, we had our internal code freeze this week. Actually, I think today is the official day. So a few things still squeezing in there. But for the most part, it's just about baked. So we're at the point now where we're going to be hard at work fixing all the nits and bugs and basically turning it into what's going to become beta 1, which we're expecting sometime during the second week of February. Again, dates could change, so take that with a grain of salt if you're watching this later, but we expect it around that time frame. Some of the exciting new stuff, the Incus LXC containers, that part's actually working pretty darn well now. I'd recommend if people are on nightlies, give those a whirl. If you find issues, report them now. Maybe we can get the fixes into the beta. That'd be great. The VM section of that, though, still has a few things we're aware of. There's some nits, and I think we have like a dozen tickets open. The backend's actually in pretty darn good shape there. Again, it's Incus based, so we didn't really reinvent a lot of wheels, but there's a little bit of UI work still to do, a lot of nits just to expose the right kind of ISO settings and setting different rootfs sizes on your ZVol, and just a lot of the little things that just have to get exposed properly that are available on the backend side.
Absolutely. I know we got a viewer question and we will answer your question later. It was related to Incus and VM, so we will get to that. Don't worry. We're not avoiding you.
Absolutely. And you got that in perfect timing, by the way. I think that came in
excellent.
like an hour right before we started recording. So good timing. And remember, send them into the email t3@truenas.com if you want to get them read on the show. That's the place to do it. But back to the Fangtooth side. So applications, I know folks have been eagerly waiting support for being able to select IP addresses for your apps. That is coming. Some of the work for that landed just this past week. We will be updating apps to start exposing those knobs as the beta, RC, and release cycle progresses. What that's going to look like, just from a quick high-level functionality standpoint, is you'll go into TrueNAS, into your network section. You can add all the IP address aliases you want to your heart's content. Once they're added there, then on the app section, you'll have a drop-down that says, I'd like to bind to this particular IP for this particular app, and then life goes on. So it's going to be much, much nicer. The thing is, it's going to be a little slow how we roll these out, just as a heads up, because as soon as we upgrade an app in the catalog to support this, it does make it incompatible with electric eel. So we're going to have to be careful in how we prioritize adding these. We're going to start with new apps, of course. That'll make sense. But as the old apps, start moving into the Fangtooth era, that's when we'll start exposing the knobs. So there'll be a little bit of churn. Bear with us, but the result's going to be worth it. We'll get through it, and everyone's going to love having that option. I know I'm eager to have it myself.
Definitely. Multiple IP addresses has been a pretty big ask in the apps community. So it's coming. For those of you who are thinking about, jumping on the Fangtooth beta, make sure that, again, this is something that we'll recommend for only our, extremely early adopters or testers at this point. But there will be a path to go from beta through RC up to release. Those of you on the nightlies have noticed that there isn't a path from the nightlies to officially upgrade. The beta is going to be the first point where I'll say anybody who likes to use their TrueNAS system at home, that would be the earliest I'd suggest that you jump in.
Agreed. But happy testing. Again, let us know if you find things.
Absolutely. So I'm going to jump in a bit. There was some talk about the fast dedupe, and we hinted at maybe there's better ways to save some space. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about compression, space savings, and some of the different knobs you can tune on ZFS and TrueNAS to maybe get a little bit more out of your drives. So obviously there's different ways to save your space. With OpenZFS, we have the transparent compression in line. We have new features such as block cloning. And of course we have deduplication, which has been, panned pretty hardly in the past for being a bit of a drag on resources. The fast dedupe is expected to help it, but it is still a case of if you don't actually have a lot of duplicate data, it's still not free. You don't want to just turn it on and hope that you're going to get some sort of small amount of savings and that it'll be worthwhile. Compression, on the other hand, it's pretty universally awesome. And the algorithm that we chose was chosen by OpenZFS as the default is the LZ4 algorithm. Now, that one works extremely well because it has very rapid compression speed when compared to things like, the old GZs or BZIPs. The decompression speed is also extremely, extremely fast. I will put some numbers up on the screen for those of you watching, and for those of you listening to this as an audio, I'll see if I can read them out for you. So basically on a single core, like a per core basis on one of our mini units, you're able to compress at roughly, 250 megabytes a second with LZ4 as compared to the, slower 155 megabytes a second of Z standard. For those of you who are doing math, you're going to notice that both of those numbers are faster than a standard gigabit network connection. So if you're just on gig networking at home, you could probably switch your compression algorithm to Z standard, have effectively no impact on your performance, and probably squeeze out a little bit better compression results. So the Z standard actually in the sort of the test data set that was used for this, the Silesia compression corpus, it's a variety of text files, image files, media files. Z standard actually resulted with a net 3.65 to 1 compression average as opposed to LZ4, which was 2.34. So you're saving a significant amount of space. You're not paying a performance penalty with it. What's important, though, is that you realize there is a certain level of diminishing returns. If you try to crank this up to Z standard 9, for example, you will get better compression. You'll get a 4.6% on the average. However, your compression speed is going to go down to about 16 megabytes a second. That's megabytes. So you're now down to almost, 100 meg fast Ethernet speeds.
Most people don't want that trade-off.
Most people don't want that trade-off. A lot of people suggested maybe that's useful for if you had some archive data that you were going to load on once and never touched again. But the challenge is that sometimes Z standard is a bit better, but the other things like the Z-libs, as you compress more, your decompression speed is also going to drop. So you have to kind of make those trade-offs. But generally speaking, if you're looking at something like deduplication, take a look at your compression ratios first and say, hey, let's maybe see what happens if I switch from LZ4 to Z standard instead. Now, somebody might ask, hey, if Z standard's so awesome, why isn't it the default compression method in ZFS yet? I mean, at this point, it is a newer algorithm. There are maybe some concerns with decompression speed as well. LZ4 is still faster. It's still lighter weight when you're doing other CPU intensive things. And there are some functionalities in LZ4 like the early abort when it detects an incompressible chunk of data. There's been some logic added to OpenZFS to give Z standard an equivalent sort of early abort where it's actually using LZ4 as the test case. It says LZ4 is so fast at compressing things. We'll see if it compresses with LZ4 first. If it does, it was often still faster to do a second pass with Z standard at a higher compression level than it would be to just try to do it with Z standard first. That was how quick LZ4 is. So
that means it's like zero cost to basically just turn it on everywhere.
Yeah. It's basically free, and that's why we suggest that you leave it on at all times unless you are 100% sure that you have nothing but incompressible data. If you're, for example, encrypting and compressing your files, if they're backup files that you're sending to your TrueNAS, that's probably a case where you won't really gain any advantage. If you're storing nothing but media files that are already compressed with a lossy codec, if you're MPEG-4, HVAC, AV1, they're already compressed really well. You're not going to get anything out of a compression algorithm or those.
But you mean Linux ISOs, right?
Well, those are legally obtained Linux ISOs from your own personal collection of Linux ISOs. Of course,
a lot of digital historians out there.
Absolutely,
got to stick to our community.
Yeah, thank you to all of those who are dedicated and archiving the various versions of Linux that have been created over the years. But there of course are the other methods of space savings. We've got block cloning in there, which has been extended so that it works over SMB and other remote protocols. That is basically for if you have data and you're making copies of it. It's very, very minimal overhead to do that. That's almost like a free level of deduplication. I tried to call it, faster deduplication, but nobody wanted to go with that. But again, it's very use case dependent. Compression is sort of the universally applicable one. Again, I'll put that scatter plot back up on the screen and I'll link it in the comments down below. And we'll try to continue updating this. And I'll maybe go into a longer comment on the forums for those who want to have a little bit of back and forth in the commentary. So join me on there and we'll continue on the discussion with that.
Excellent. Well, remember, it's all use case specific. The reason defaults is because it tries to hit the biggest amount of folks with the widest use case. But if you know what your use case is and you know the specifics, you can always tune TrueNAS for a bunch of different things, not just compression and deduplication, but performance as well. There's lots of knobs to turn.
Absolutely. All right,
Oh,
Kris.
I
Well,
guess it's time.
yeah,
Let me get
get
my
get your
soapbox out. Here we
get your
go.
soapbox out, get the vent hat on. Let's do this.
By popular request, we've had folks who've asked me, and so this is actually an interesting topic. People have asked me, has my personal view on open source licensing really changed over the years? I guess I've been doing this long enough now. People ask me questions like that. It feels weird to me, but hey, I'll go with it. It's fun. So most folks who know anything about me, I've been a huge proponent of the BSD license for the past couple decades now. And I'm really not new to this space and talking about it at all. This was one of the driving factors of my desktop project, PCBSD, back in the day. This would have been the very early 2000s when I got this start. I want to say 4, 3, somewhere in the, I'd have to go back and look at the earliest change logs to see, but it was early. As well as my work on TrueOS, my work on FreeBSD in general. And I mean, if you look, I've been speaking about this for years. But what's interesting is, I mean, I still like the BSD license, and why not? There's a lot to like about it. I mean, for starters, it's as simple as they come. I mean, go look at it. Go look up the BSD 3-cause license. You can read it. I mean, if you retain, basically what it says is just retain the copyright notice on anything you ship that includes this code, and either if you ship it in source or binary distribution, that's fine. The other clause is, don't let the author's names imply that they endorse anything that you're doing with your code. And lastly, don't sue us. I mean, again, what's not to love? I can understand that. I can explain that in 60 seconds. It's simple. I didn't have to get a lawyer involved. It's kind of the ultimate freedom of your source code. You can do anything with it. Emphasis on anything. Highlight that word. We'll come back to that. And if you go take a look at the history again, you'll probably even find recordings and talks of me, talks I've given at Linux conferences, OSCon, Southeast Linux Fest, Ohio Linux Fest, Indiana Linux Fest, Texas Linux Fest. I mean, I made the circuit for quite a number of years there, going out and talking about BSD, PCBSD, and one of the things that was kind of a key feature of the talk was the BSD license. And for those who ask, well, what's the most popular license today? Well, actually, it's the MIT license, but that's just an even more simple version of the BSD license if you compare them side by side. So again, a lot to love there. And I don't really have anything against that.
Yeah,
but then on the other
side,
side,
I mean, you went right into the heart of Linux and you're advocating for the BSD license. That was definitely courageous.
Absolutely. I don't know if I won any fans, but it was an interesting talk. We had lively conversations. It was spirited at many of these conferences. So it was fun. And again, those videos might still be floating around there. Don't send them to me. I don't want to watch it. I don't like watching my old stuff. But anyway. But then, of course, there's this other license you may have heard of called the GPL. So in brief, for those who aren't super up to speed on this, the GPL is also an open source license. It's a little different. It's a copyleft license versus a copyright. And one of the defining properties that make it a copyleft is that it's viral, in the sense that any code which derives from GPL code must also be licensed under the same or a compatible GPL license. Again, it reduces options and what you can do with it. That emphasis on anything, there's a little less anything you can do with it. It has restrictions. It's a longer license. Go read it, compare it, and you'll see what I mean. I mean, especially if you go from GPL 2 to 3, it gets longer because there's a longer list of things that you are required to do upon receiving this code and building something off of it. Now, of course, they had reasons for doing this back in the day when Stallman and others wrote the license. They had a philosophy, and that's fine. And it was, in essence, done to ensure that something that was released into the wild as open source would remain open source long into the future. So as code evolves and companies or individuals contribute towards it, it should always remain open, and which means we have access to it and can see it. And how does it stack up in the wild? Well, GPL does have a vastly smaller footprint. I Googled it this morning, did some real quick research for the show. It's somewhere in the 22% of open source projects are GPL based, and a whopping 78% are some sort of MIT license. MIT and Apache are the most popular. I think BSD was a third most popular license. And that's a huge, huge difference. So why does it seem like GPL has such an impact if it is such a smaller percentage? Well, let's think about this for a second. The Linux kernel is GPL. And I'd argue that, and I don't even have to argue, the vast majority of open source software, all those things written in MIT BSD licenses, the vast, vast majority are all running on top of Linux. So you could say in many ways that GPL is the thing that runs the rest of the open source ecosystem. Not that you can't point to examples. Sure, some stuff runs on FreeBSD. Sure, you run some open source code on Mac or on Windows even these days. It happens. But at its heart, Any server you're talking to, services, cloud services, again, Linux is king there.
Yeah.
We can't argue that.
Mobile phones. There's this little operating system you might have heard of called Android.
Absolutely. I was going to say Linux. I mean, we tend to sometimes look at, segments. So on the desktop, it's small single digits. Again, quick Google search this morning said it's just barely up to 2%. I think it's a little below 2% on desktop. Server and mobile, though, different story. Linux is the dominant force there, hands down, not even in dispute, right? So what are my views on licensing? Well, over the years, I have grown a bit of nuance in my views here. And hey, I don't mind admitting when my views have evolved or changed. We're human beings. Our views should always be evolving and changing as facts change and as we get new information and as we see the results, because it's one thing to be a proponent of something, but in practice, sometimes it doesn't work out that way. So where I'm at today, hey, I still love the BSD license, the MIT license, the other kind of copyright licenses, the simplicity. I mean, there's a lot to love there. For a lot of libraries, small tools, things that are just intended to be released and there's no commercial potential, home projects where you just want to put it out there and not think about it and just give everyone the ultimate freedom to do anything. Again, there's that word again, you want, play with it to your heart's content. Absolutely. It's a great license for that. However, I do think today there's an important place in the world for GPL, and I'll explain why. So I have a few decades of experience under my belt now, and my own views on kind of the good and bad and the pros and cons of each license have shifted somewhat. And I think someday, I don't know who's going to be one to write the book. I don't want to, but, we'll see if someone else does. I think somebody will write the history of Unix-like operating systems, and I'm sure there's people who are already talking and writing about this. But I have a feeling, I don't doubt in the future, the historians are going to look back and conclude that perhaps the BSD license for a kernel/operating system, since I know FreeBSDs both, may have been one of the Achilles heels of FreeBSD and other BSDs in general, and why they didn't become dominant in the marketplace here now in 2024, and we'll see what the future looks like. So why, Kris? Why do you say that? Well, for one thing, kernel development, I don't know if most of you know this, you should. Kernel development's really hard work. We're talking specialized expertise. This isn't your average, just developer. A lot of folks, we do Python, we do JavaScript, we write userland apps. The people who want to go work in virtual memory systems and device drivers, that's a special breed. Those folks don't come cheap. Again, they're rare. Most of them work at companies. This is an important part of making a kernel, right? On the BSD side, and I used to say this myself, we used to tout, and we'd love saying it, Apple's based on BSD. Sony, I guess you didn't know this, uses BSD in the PlayStation, or they did. I don't know what's currently in the new version. Maybe pieces of it are still there.
Pretty sure PS4 was BSD. I don't know about PS5. We'd have to check in on that.
I think 5 may have evolved, but again, they're pretty secretive. Yeah. Nintendo uses BSD. You didn't know that, but the Switch, I think, has BSD, and I think the Wii did too. But anyway, big names we all heard of, right? And I used to go to the conferences, and we loved touting that. And of course, you throw the Netflixes out there and a few big names, and folks go, oh my God, that sounds cool. But the one thing that unfortunately most of those names have in common is that they gave little to nothing back to the BSD kernel as a result. Remember, I emphasize the word anything. They took the kernel, adapted it for their own means, closed sourced it, and made gobs of money off it as a result. Meanwhile, the version that we all have access to, the open source version of the kernel, doesn't get much of that work back for the general public good, for it to evolve as a product and as a kernel and an operating system. So companies go and they pay really expensive engineers to do really cool things, like for the PlayStation. I've heard little bits and pieces of what they did there. It was awesome, like really cool. Did you ever see any of it? Nope. Did you get any of it back? Nope. Did BSD as a result benefit? Nope. But that's how it goes. It's a license that allows that.
It was permitted by the license terms, and therefore
by the
they
license terms.
We'll do it.
Now, granted, there are some good corporate citizens out there who try to upstream and keep the spirit of the license. I mean, I know IX was one of those. I was one of those. A bunch of us were. But unfortunately, that was a much smaller list, much shorter list of companies not to the size or magnitude of those guys I'm talking about, and not sufficient enough to keep the code base modern and diverse enough to keep its relevance in the wider industry. I mean, that's just the facts. That's how I see it. Again, welcome to disagree. I'm happy to take arguments. But this is what I'm looking at with 20 years of history now and saying, oh, this is an interesting observation. I have a feeling that's how historians are going to look at it too. Now, on the Linux side, It's GPL. It's always been GPL, which means companies that take it and develop products based on that kernel are compelled by license terms to make sure the resulting code was released back into the wild as open source.
Sometimes
Now,
those companies need a little bit of encouragement to release their resulting code, but
you got
there,
it.
there is a licensing requirement to do that.
Absolutely. And, while some of them didn't go to all the trouble to put it back into the mainline kernel, they released it, which meant much of it did make its way into the kernel. And along the way, I think a lot of successful corporations, after you kind of drug them kicking and screaming to do it the first time, they kind of figured out the secret sauce is that it's actually easier to contribute back what you can to the kernel directly, because then it has longer term benefits for you for future upgrades of products and stuff. Maintaining forks are expensive, and some companies do it. Apple does it. Apple is their fork of BSD. You can't even call it BSD at this point. It's so different, but
What do they call it? Darwin?
Yeah, Darwin, it's mock-based, it's evolved a lot. But, the point is sometimes you have to nudge the companies and individuals to kind of do the right thing in this case. And that was where the GPL, I think, shined. And the BSD, let's face it, humans were lazy. Corporations are going to do what's the cheapest and most cost-effective to get their product out the door and make money. That's just how humans are motivated, how we work. But the GPL kind of enforced a good behavior, which then as a result, I believe, made Linux the stronger kernel in the long run, because now a lot of folks are contributing to it, and they're, whether they want to or not, I think most of them now want to because they see the benefit. But unfortunately, that meant BSD kind of, fell behind in many ways. So I think it's an interesting case study. And if you're a historian out there someday in the future watching this podcast, I hope you've written a book or are writing a book on kind of a case study between the two experiments, on the case of, where the open, more copyright licenses made sense versus the copyleft licenses. And I think the GPL was the smarter choice for those lower level kernels and the real foundational items that you have to use to build a successful ecosystem. So that's my 2 cents on it. Again, it's a little bit of a soapbox, and I don't mind hopping on the soapbox from time to time and tell you where I think I was wrong in the past. But again, doesn't mean I don't like the BSD license. I just feel like at the end, maybe we'll look back and say, yeah, the GPL was probably the right choice for the kernel. And maybe it would have been for some user land stuff too. And I'm sure is.
Yeah. Well, it was, you decided in just, believe last year it was that was the best choice for TrueNAS as well for the software. You relicensed a lot of our own code under it.
Absolutely. So you could say my attitude shifted. We put our money where our mouth is. So the funny thing was, when we were considering that here internally, we looked at the licenses and we said, that's weird. We love the BSD license, but we literally are not taking advantage of it in the sense that we intend this code to remain open source. And the only reason we'd keep it BSD is if we intended to close it at some point, which again, that anything keyword, right? Well, I'm not planning on closing that door. So we ended up in this past year, I believe it was early this last year, 2024, we relicensed most of the code under GPL v3 and LGPL v3, depending on which repo and what components and all that. But, that was done out of the best intentions to make sure TrueNAS remains free and open for the good of the world going into the future, because you have a product where somebody could potentially take it, fork it, and close it. And, it doesn't benefit everyone else and, stifle some of that innovation. So, again, my views obviously have evolved. The GPL didn't scare us. We decided it was important that your storage remain forever open, especially under the hood and the things that matter. So there you have it. End rant.
Yeah, there you go. Well, it's good to end on that note of, ensuring that the base of TrueNAS is always going to be free and open for the good of everybody using it and the good of everybody who has yet to discover it going forward.
Absolutely. And again, I don't have any bones with companies that have to make commercial offerings and make money. That's how we get paid. That's how engineers get paid. We have families to feed. We have mortgages and cars to buy and groceries to buy, and kids need braces and all. We're the same as everyone else out there, right? Engineers don't do this just for, the goodwill out of their heart. And some do. There's certain projects at a certain size where it's a passion project, and more power to those. I love those folks. But at some point where it's like, no, it's just too big for that. You can't just be a hobby passion project anymore. There's a company behind it. Takes a lot of resources to bring something like TrueNAS out to the market. We have a very large team of software engineers, QA testers, all that. So you can have this great, awesome product that we call TrueNAS, right? So again, I don't begrudge folks. And in most cases, They find some way of making the two work together. You have some things that are, cool bonuses you can get that aren't really necessary to the community experience to make it a good product. But then there's some things that make sense for the enterprise. That's, again, a good thing. There's plenty of models out there where people do that. And IX is no different in that way. So more power to you. But again, I think at the end of the day, the stuff that matters, the open source bits, I'd have to look at the GPL these days. Like, I think there's a lot of merit to that argument.
Awesome.
Okay.
Right. Well, hey, let's
get into our question. Read it.
Yeah,
for us
let's
here?
circle back to that audience question here. Tugging back to the start of the podcast here, where we're talking about Fangtooth. So we have a question from Andrej again. Thank you. He says, "Hi, Kris. How will you approach migration of VMs from the existing libvirt backend to the new Incus one? Will Fangtooth contain both VM backends so users can migrate one by one, or will it be a sort of cutover switch like with Docker?"
Yeah, we're going the cutover route. It is really hard to keep them both running in parallel cleanly and then deal with this breaks that and that breaks this, and it gets messy, right? So when we looked at it, we did opt to go for a cutover route. So the old VM UI will go away. When you upgrade, you'll have to go and import your VM disks again in the Incus system. We looked at migrators, but it wasn't as clean as going, say, from Helm charts to Docker Compose. I mean, there's even tools that kind of help automate that process because they're very similar, and not so in this change. So we decided, again, we opted to say, you know what? It's a one-time migration. If you're running VMs, you got the ZVol, you got the disk image, you got everything you need. You're going to have to go and just say, I'd like to import it. And by the way, now you'll have new options to set. So if you want to go set up VNC, that's going to be an option again. I know a lot of folks have been asking for that back. That's actually working in the nightlies now. I was so tickled pink the other day because you just click the button and boom, your VMC viewer comes up. It's pretty nice. Yeah. But anywho, so yeah, a little bit of churn. Apologies. We'll have some notes in the release notes on how to do that migration. So just make sure you read them beforehand and know what you're getting into, and set aside a little bit of time to do the migration. But once it's done, it's done. You can move on.
Yeah, and notably, my understanding is you're not migrating the data itself. So it's not a case of you need double the space in order to copy your disk. You're not copying or changing your virtual disk at all. It's like kind of the metadata and the way that VM's configured. It was configured with a libvirt XML before. It's going to need to be configured with an Incus XML now. There's lots
XML,
of...
Don't say that.
Sorry. It's
XML's evil.
It was XML back in the day, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think
it was XML. Now it's JSON.
I think it's JSON in the back. I'd have to.
Oh, thank goodness.
Maybe somebody in the comments will say, actually, I know what Incus is off the top of my head. I forget now. But
okay. Well, yeah. If you know, please tell us down in the comments. And any other questions, if you have them, you can drop them in the comments. You can give us some feedback on what we said today. And again, thank you for tuning into the podcast today. As always, just like Kris said, if you have further questions, you want us to read your question and answer it on the call, drop it into t3@truenas.com. Join us in the conversation in the forums at forums.truenas.com. Don't forget to do the usual YouTube thing of liking the video, subscribing so you don't miss the episode. And we'll see you next week.